Now that VIFF is over, how do you feel how do you feel about the film selection this year? Because I know we talked about this a little bit with TIFF and how like it felt like a little bit more muted. There weren't as many like big buzzy titles. Did you feel like that was the case with VIFF this year? Like a difference from last year or the year before?
Oh yeah, 100%. There wasn't any long lineups. That was a big difference for me. You used to have to like show up like 20 minutes before you're showing,
right,
in order to find like a decent seat. But for a lot of the films, I showed up like 5 minutes before it started, and there were plenty of seats because they were all like socially distanced.
Right.
So, and a lot of people, I think this time around, like depending on what time your showing was, you could stream it at home at the same time.
Oh, right.
So I thought that was really neat. I really enjoyed the streaming aspect of it, being able to watch movies from home. I think that's a huge positive. I don't necessarily need the festival crowd, around me, because sometimes I hate the insensate clapping that happens. Like even if it's a bad film, like people clap at the end. I'm like, why are we clapping? But you're right. Like I think part of it's pandemic induced. I think the number of movies that debuted at VIFF or were shown at VIFF were slightly less than years before. And I think maybe the quality overall suffered a little bit, but I think that also depends on what you watch.
Yeah.
But for sure, there wasn't one real standout this year. Not like Parasite like 2 years ago or even some of the bigger names in the past.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess that's just kind of the theme of festival season as a whole, I guess. I mean, and in some cases, it feels like some of the really buzzy stuff has ended up at other festivals this year. Like I feel like Venice and the New York Film Festival got things like, say, the new Joel Cohen Macbeth, or a few of the other ones that are like really catching the eye of critics. So,
but those ones I feel like just have more bigger names attached to them.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a film that I've read or heard about that has really blown everyone away.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, let's get into the episode. Welcome to a bonus episode of the Extra Buttery Podcast, the free-flowing conversation between two guys who love movies and TV. And this episode, as you could probably guess from the cold open, is going to be all about this year's Vancouver International Film Festival. We covered it last year, and we're very grateful to get some advanced access to a couple of films, and the same is true this year. We enjoyed some screeners. Jason got out and saw a few movies in person, and we have quite a few things to run through in this episode. So maybe to kick things off, I mean, you obviously saw quite a bit more than I did, but I'll just go with something that I was initially kind of curious about before it started hitting festival season, and that's the new film from Sean Baker, Red Rocket.
Your last job is over 17 years ago. That's quite a gap.
Well, I've worked almost every day for the last 17 years. I moved back in with my wife last week.
No, I'm calling the cops. 10, 9,
Really?
8.
We decided to make a run of it.
I just need a place to crash for a couple of days. What's the big deal?
Mikey, go fuck yourself.
All right, look, I'm going to be straight with you. I'm an adult film actor.
And I know you just posted a review up on the site on this specifically, but of the two of us, you might be, maybe you're a bigger fan of Sean Baker. I don't know. I mean, I really enjoyed The Florida Project. I really liked Tangerine, but I feel like you talk about The Florida Project more than I do, maybe. So I don't know. But like, were you excited to see Red Rocket, or were you just sort of cautiously optimistic?
I was excited. I think I just tend to gravitate towards characters who are degenerates.
Yeah, well, he's good. Sean Baker's good at finding those.
Exactly. And people who live on the fringes and may be good on the inside, but for whatever reason, their moral compass is kind of skewed or broken. I love those kind of flawed characters. So yeah, Red Rocket, filmed in 24 days in 2020 during COVID. So really I think, indicative of how Sean Baker works, like micro budget, smaller budget, casting people that you have never heard of or are just starting their acting careers or may not ever have acted professionally before, putting them in situations that they're very familiar with and just letting these characters sort of go about their way. So Red Rocket is about this ex-porn star named Mikey Saber, who returns to his real town called Texas City in Texas. And it's one of those Gulf Coast area oil refinery towns, so there's not a lot going on. And Mikey Saber comes back after having washed out in LA from the porn industry. He's trying to get back on his feet. He ends up reconnecting with his estranged ex-wife and meets this high school redhead nicknamed Strawberry. And basically the story is that he thinks Strawberry is his way back into the porn industry because she's into the same two things that he's really into, weed and sex.
Right. So I guess the question I have going into this is, do you think that sort of, well, that what's probably like technically like statutory rape in a lot of states. Do you think
I don't think so in Texas, actually. I'm
maybe not
sure
in Texas,
that,
but I mean, a relationship that a lot of people would frown on. Not to mention a character who is trying to encourage this younger girl into doing something that could really like victimize her if you know. Do you think that's a hard sell for audiences? Do you think it might be like people might see that and not really, or find it harder to sympathize with the hero of the film?
I think that's one of the reasons why maybe this film hasn't really caught on. The scene where Mikey Saber first kisses Strawberry or first makes his move, I think there was like an audible gasp in the audience. Because you're right, there is like an exploitation sort of factor to it. But I think what helps is that Strawberry isn't portrayed as this like really naive young girl. I think she's really bright and yeah, she may not know what Mikey Saber is all about, but I think for the most part, she's usually in control of the situation. In fact, more so than all the other characters. I remember, so Sean Baker was actually at the screening. I didn't even know he was going to show up, and there was a Q&A at the end. And someone in the audience asked him about how Mikey Saber's character arc doesn't happen, like he doesn't change at the end of the film. He's the same sort of person who tries to take advantage of everyone. He's sort of a snake oil salesman. And Sean Baker's answer was, well, basically, you shouldn't watch the movie through Mikey Saber's POV. You should see it through his ex-wife's POV, where this guy who she barely knew comes back in and just totally turns her life upside down. I kind of agree where he's coming from. I understand it, but I think the better POV is Strawberry's POV. I think she undergoes. You don't see the entire change, but it's implied that she does change after she, does her thing with Mickey. I don't want to spoil the movie too much, but I think it's much more interesting from her perspective, because here's this guy trying to exploit her, and it never feels like he's the first one to ever try and do so. I think she kind of willingly goes along with it, and it's a hard lesson to learn for her. But I just thought it was interesting that Sean Baker intentionally didn't give Mikey Saber a full character arc.
Yeah. Well, I'd be curious now. I mean, I know that Baker got quite a bit of attention. I think didn't he pick up a nomination for best original screenplay for the Florida Project?
I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah. Along with I'm pretty sure the Willem Dafoe got a nomination for best supporting, and so I mean that movie got a certain amount of Oscar love. So do you think this movie will go that far?
No, not at all. It's not on the same level as Florida Project. The plot and the characters aren't nearly deep or interesting enough. And yeah, it's a fine film. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if most people would, just because of the content and subject matter. But I do think it's worth watching, because the lead actor, his name is Simon Rex. He's also a former porn actor. I don't want to say a star, but he became a thespian. He became like a radio host, a DJ, did all sorts of things. And he is the one who really drives the movie. Without him, it doesn't work. He's just a joy to watch.
Right. So it's one of those kind of movies where it's the performances that kind of pull it through, and you know, your mileage may vary depending on how well you connect with those performances.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So then jumping around to something completely different then, how about Wife of a Spy? Tell me about that one.
Okay. So
audible sigh.
I really wanted this to be good. It's been a while since I've seen a Japanese film that's really blown me away. I think the most recent one was Shoplifters from VIFF, a year or two ago. Japanese films tend to be really subdued, slow burn, quiet, contemplative. The problem with Wife of a Spy is I couldn't connect with the main character at all. So the story is about a wife, a good housewife, who discovers that her husband is a spy, hence the name of the movie. And at times she is this devoted wife who is willing to go along with whatever the husband asks. At other times, though, she seems to be a legitimate patriot of Japan and is willing to do anything it takes to help Japan win the war and maintain its status quo, basically. So I never quite understood the character, because to me, those two things are very opposite of each other.
Right.
The actress who portrayed the main character, Yui Aoi, she got a lot of praise for her performance, but even though like I knew what she was trying to do, I disagreed with a lot of the decisions she made. I think her character was all over the map. I couldn't make heads or tails of what her personality is, what her motivations were. And I think that's what made it probably the reason why it was such a tough watch. The cinematography I found really weird, because anytime they were in a room with windows, like the sunlight was just blinding. Now, I don't know if that was a conscious decision or if they were filming on some sort of set where they didn't have the background, like the exterior, like outside exterior background.
Yeah.
But I thought that was super distracting. It was a very disjointed film, and I was ultimately pretty disappointed by it. So you can skip this one, Rob.
Okay. All right. Noted. So then, well, I'll transfer over from that to one that I saw. Also kind of disappointing. This is a Canadian film called All My Puny Sorrows, based on a novel by, I believe it's a novel by a Canadian author named Miriam Taves. And this is a one that it also played here at TIFF, and I remember putting it on my shortlist initially just because I'd heard of Miriam Taves before. I hadn't read any of her work, but I was just curious, you know, if I were to jump into this thing blind, what would I find? And this story ends up being that of a 30-something woman played by Alison Pill, who finds out that her sister, who's been living in Manitoba, I think Winnipeg somewhere, despite being a wildly successful concert pianist with a great career and lots of money and an adoring husband, has tried to kill herself. And we learn over the course of flashbacks that this isn't new. This sister has expressed intentions to do this before. They also lost their father to suicide. And so the movie kind of unspools, and it's dealing with like the family's attempts to grapple with what seems to be a bit of like maybe even a hereditary predisposition to depression and suicide. And there are connections to how the family grew up as part of the local Mennonite community, and the kind of like closed down, very austere attitudes in that community, at least as interpreted by this screenplay. And you know, the central actors, Alison Pill and Sarah Gadon, do a fine job with the material, but it is so bleak and so.
The type of movie you need to shower afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, there are brief moments of levity that attempt to kind of raise things up, but it just grinds you down over the course of like an hour and 40 minutes, and you're left at the end of it being like, I don't really know what I was supposed to get out of that, other than, maybe sympathy for these people, but even
Right.
then it's hard to sustain. So I mean, if you really are if you're maybe a huge fan of the original source material, you really like Miriam Toews' work, then maybe the movie's for you, but otherwise I would steer clear.
Could you ever like a film for being bleak?
Certain ones, yeah, like I'm trying to think now, like
I always default to Requiem for a Dream, where it's like a brilliant film, but I never ever want to watch it again.
Yeah. One that actually comes to mind is a documentary about genocide, actually.
Oh, The Killing Fields or something like that?
Yeah, that one. There was actually 2 documentaries made. I'm trying to think of the one that I saw about the same topic. But yeah, like genocide in the Philippines, I believe it was, or Indonesia. And that was something where like you just like you get hammered by all of the weight of like all the killing that went on in this particular time period in this country, and how kind of cavalier the people involved were towards the acts that they carried out. Acts of killing, that's what it's called.
Right.
And that's something where like you come out of it, I mean, you really only want to watch it once and maybe twice, but the way it was pulled off was kind of fulfilling and interesting and involving. So I feel like it balanced itself out there, and it wasn't the same kind of after feeling that you get from All My Puny Sorrows.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I think that's a great point. Like it's hard to enjoy a movie sometimes when the subject material is so tough.
Yeah, and I mean this one film that I saw was like it was also shot with very cold, muted cinematography too. So I mean, there wasn't even any kind of like color or anything to kind of like balance it out. It was just very flat.
A lot of wheat fields.
Yeah, a lot of wheat fields. A lot of people wandering around in the middle of the winter in heavy parkas, just looking sad. So
yeah.
So in an attempt to lift things up a little bit, maybe let's talk about official competition.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it was announced today, shortly after VIFF, that this film won the Audience Award.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So basically, this film was the highest rated film as per audience voting.
Cool. Okay.
So official competition, Spanish film starring Penelope Cruz, Antonio Banderas, and Oscar Martinez. Penelope Cruz plays this genius director who has to deal with the egos of 2 fictional actors portrayed by Banderas and Martinez. So basically the story is this rich Spanish guy is trying to leave behind a legacy. He doesn't want to be known just as a rich person. So he's trying to adapt this Nobel Peace Prize winning book. Well, no, not Nobel Peace Prize, but Nobel winning book.
Oh, okay. Nobel for fiction, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. Or something like that. It's a famous book. He's trying to adapt it, trying to create this movie, and it would be part of his legacy that he leaves behind. And so the comedy is Penelope Cruz as the director trying to make it through rehearsals between 2 actors who just absolutely hate each other. And constantly they're trying to one-up each other through either, Hollywood style backstabbings with, discussions with the director and executives. Hey, give me more scenes, or hey, maybe cut this guy out. Meanwhile, during rehearsals, they're trying to mock each other's acting style and lifestyle, trying to belittle each other. And Penelope Cruz is stuck in the middle, but at the same time, she's also this sort of like eccentric genius, and she has an ego of her own as well. And she's trying to make these 2 actors really uncomfortable because she wants to push them to the limit.
Right.
Not unlike a lot of directors out there, say like David Fincher, who makes people do like 100 takes, right?
Right.
Not to that extent, but like a similar sort of effect. So I don't want to spoil too much, but I think this is a film that you would really like. Because it's about the industry. The acting is really great, and it's genuinely funny at certain points. My one gripe is the ending. It's one of the it makes fun of Hollywood a lot, but then you kind of get sick of the satire because it's too much, and then you start wondering, like, am I not watching the one thing that it's trying to make fun of? Like when you're satirizing something, you kind of become part of the satire yourself, because it's a film that's poking fun at film, so eventually it kind of comes around in a full circle. Right.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean by that. Because movies that are about movies can can have that navel gazing quality to it, and then you do find yourself grappling a little bit with like, you know, are you feeding into the exact thing that they're critiquing? And that's sort of a dynamic that you have when watching The Player, which we talked about in a bonus episode a few months ago, where it's the, you know, that whole movie is about the kind of cyclical self-fulfilling prophecies of movie making, and I feel like there might be some similar stuff on the go here. But okay, cool. Well, I mean, this was one that I was also on my short list for TIFF movies, so I feel like I will eventually be seeing this when it's more widely available. So that's good news. Yeah. So how about we talk about Girlfriends?
Okay. So this was kind of advertised to me as sort of like a version of Bridesmaids.
Okay.
So it's about 4 friends who kind of reconnect after being apart for a while. They kind of have this coming of age moment where, you know, all their old sort of grudges come to the surface, and by the end, I mean, in a cliched fashion, they kind of work it through and they remain great friends. And that's basically the gist of it. I found this very dull. It wasn't particularly funny. I didn't think the actors were particularly strong, and but I also don't think they had much to work with. I think the main character is very unlikable. She's meant to be unlikable, but it's not like a Kristen Wiig where it doesn't feel like she's at fault all the time. Marta, the main character, she does kind of feel like she's the aggressor all the time. Never do we ever feel like she's the victim. In fact, I sympathize more with her 3 friends who, frankly, I don't think get enough screen time. And you can see, you know, there's some chemistry there, but the characters I just don't find very well defined, and they don't seem to, you know, other than having this shared past, I don't think they move forward together other than just rekindling their past friendship.
Okay, so it's a little bit one note then.
It is pass. This one's a pass too.
Okay. All right. Well, skipping along to maybe something that's also sort of in a similar category for you, at least in terms of like yes, no. Benediction.
Yeah, this one's a no too.
Okay.
So I was originally attracted to this film because of Jack Lowden. Jack Lowden played one of the pilots in Dunkirk. He's the one that gets stuck in water. I thought he was really great in it. He's done like a lot of other movies. He did Small Axe. He did Capone, and on all these films, even though he had small roles, I thought he was really good. So Benediction, Jack Lowden plays Siegfried Sassoon, who I've never heard of until this movie. Yeah. Very famous English wartime poet. Becomes very anti-war, becomes disillusioned by the war effort, and is also a closet gay. And so this film, directed by Terrence Davies, who is also openly gay, but has publicly talked about being like struggling with his sexuality. And I think it feels more like a biographical film of Terrence Davies than Siegfried Sassoon.
Right. So he's like pouring himself or his own personal experiences into this historical figure. It
definitely feels that way. Maybe because I don't know much about Sassoon, but definitely at certain parts, this film devolves into gay people being really mad jealous at each other. There's a lot of sniping. There's a lot of, you know, really over the top, hyperbolic, you know, sentences being like, well, if you don't love me, I'm going to kill myself kind of deal.
Right.
You know,
right.
If you're not going to listen to me, well, I'm just going to storm off like a little kid. There's a lot of that going on. And then in between, you know, there's cutscenes of war footage and Jack Lowden as Sassoon kind of reading poetry from his books. It just felt like it was cobbled together. There's no connective tissue between any of the scenes, in my opinion. And I don't think it was particularly effective in any way, shape, or form. A lot of critics have said, you know, this is like a film about a sad person, and I sympathize, but I didn't feel that at all. I just felt kind of bored throughout the whole thing.
Right. Well, the first thing that sort of comes to my mind is the idea that like we've had probably hundreds, if not thousands, of movies set in either the First World War or the Second World War, where you've got young people falling in love and then falling out of love, and then there's like letters and romances that get kicked off, sure. But those have always been like heterosexual romances. So I guess maybe there's an opening there for the same sort of story, but with people struggling with being gay in a society that is not very accepting of it. So, I mean, representation is good, but if at the end of the day you're still not connecting with the characters, then you know.
Yeah, it's one of those, like, based on real people, it's supposed to be historical, but by the end I don't think I've gained any more knowledge about Sassoon or the war, or, you know, wartime anti-war poetry at the time. Like, I don't feel much more informed than I did going into it.
Right. Okay.
So this is a pass too. Unless you really want to watch Jack Lowden. He's good, but I don't think he can really save this film.
Okay. So then I'll jump in with something that I saw. And this is a movie actually that I was surprised to find out just before I screened it, was a huge winner at the Cesar Awards, which is France's version of the Oscars. Yeah. And this is a movie called BYE BYE MORONS.
Il n'existe aucune trace de votre accouchement. Puis retrouver un enfant abandonné sous X depuis 30 ans, c'est très difficile.
À ce point?
Oui, ça c'est normal. Hein. Donner, c'est donner. Reprendre, c'est voler.
Je m'excuse, mais je trouve ça trop injuste.
Quoi, on peut rien faire alors?
Ça peut prendre du temps.
Mais c'est-à-dire, j'ai un souci de santé.
Si vous êtes pressé, on s'en sort plus.
Excusez ma grossièreté. Adieu les cons.
I really wanted to see this.
Yeah, and I would pretty highly recommend it. I can see why it was a favorite at the Césars. I mean, I think it picked up at least a couple of acting prizes, cinematography, directing, writing, and it is sort of like it's got strong elements of slapstick comedy, but also this kind of interesting and maybe weird for some people, this theme of like criticism of police violence running through it. But the plot revolves around a woman who is a hairstylist, and she's only in her like mid-40s, but the film opens with her finding out from her doctor that she has a terminal illness of some kind, a terminal lung disease brought upon by all of the hair products that she was spraying into the air while working as a stylist. So there's already a bit of like a kind of more like a ironic twist to that in the opening, and she uses this news that she's terminally ill as the inspiration to finally track down the son that she gave up for adoption when she gave birth to him as a teenager. And she attempts to do this, but she's quickly stopped by all the bureaucracy of the French government. And so the film becomes a pretty strong kind of, almost like the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam, like a series of like comedic or satirical scenes showing how difficult it is to navigate all these layers of bureaucracy, and how, you know, quick-witted people can kind of charm their way around roadblocks if they know the right moves to pull off. So she ends up kind of cavorting around Paris with this IT guy who's carrying around a laptop. He's sort of like a magical hacker who can do anything. And as well as this blind guy that they dig up from the archives in some government building. And so there's all these kind of madcap things of like cars smashing into each other, people falling over. But it's shot in a remarkably vivid, interesting way. Like that's where I guess the cinematography prize came into effect, because it's got a really interesting color palette and stylized kind of look to it, which is very cool for a comedy or a slapstick, especially. A big kind of connections to the work of like Jacques Tati, movie Playtime, which also had this kind of bizarro French bureaucracy kind of critique in a lot of his movies. So yeah, I mean, if you can track it down, I highly recommend this thing. It's a lot of fun. There's some laugh out loud moments, and especially if you like those kinds of like that style of like slapstick comedy paired with satire.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I was. I'm glad to hear it was good, because this was one of the films I wanted to go see, but I couldn't make it work schedule wise.
Yeah. Okay, so then coming out of that, maybe we'll talk about something that's like probably near and dear to your heart. I know that you ranked it higher on Letterboxd than a lot of other things, and that would be Handle with Care.
Ah, yes. Okay, so this has gotten really good reviews. This actually won the True North Award for the Best Canadian Feature or Best Canadian Documentary.
Okay.
So the full title is called Handle with Care, The Legend of the NOTIC Streetball Crew. For those who don't know, streetball is street basketball. Street basketball is different from basketball you see on TV in that streetball is it's kind of like a rap battle. You're not necessarily winning by scoring more points. You're winning by showing up your opponent, by creating moves that no one had ever seen before, fancy dribbles, fancy passes. You're trying to sort of assert your dominance on the basketball court through your creativity.
And at the risk of sounding like a complete noob, is that kind of what inspired the Harlem Globetrotters?
Yes. So what the Harlem Globetrotters do is essentially streetball.
Okay.
It's a little more structured, and a lot of them were former pro basketball players. Streetball grew out of the streets. You'll often hear people talk about Rucker Park. Rucker Park is a famous basketball court in New York where a lot of inner city kids play and produce a bunch of basically cult heroes. So NOTIC is this team of street ballers from Vancouver, made up mostly of immigrants. There's one white kid from the suburbs who comes from sort of a working class, troubled home. But anyway, so the NOTIC grew to prominence when in the early 2000s, late 90s, when streetball became really like a hot thing. And Handle with Care is basically the third mixtape of the streetball crew. A mixtape is footage that they shot and edited themselves that they've turned into tapes or DVDs that they sell on the streets. So sort of the crux of the story is about this streetball crew that never got its due money-wise. They never made a lot of money, but they ended up reaching heights that they never envisioned. So their sort of impact culturally spreads out all the way to Asia, for example. There are a lot of they go on a basketball tour to Japan where they're surprised to see a lot of fans know who they are and look up to them. But the other conflict that I thought was more interesting was the sort of like business aspect of it. So the first mixtape of NOTIC was filmed by two white guys from the suburbs, not from wealthy families, but definitely not from disadvantaged backgrounds. And they had become filmmakers, and there's this sort of idea that they had exploited these kids who played streetball and didn't know better. Because if the same streetball team became popular today, there's no doubt that with all the social media out there, they would have millions of followers and tons of endorsement deals and tons of opportunities to make money. Right. And this film is kind of their own sort of way of coming to terms with sort of the past mistakes that they've that they did, and some of the experiences that they had growing up with each other when they were all very young and naive. You've seen Hoop Dreams, right?
Oh, yeah. That was going to be my question, actually, was like, would you say this is sort of like a Canadian Hoop Dreams of a sort?
Of a sort. It's not as bleak. It's not as dark. I think in Hoop Dreams, there's very much, disadvantaged black kids versus, white institutions. I don't think there's that much here, but there is definitely a conflict, a cultural divide between the filmmakers and its subjects. And I don't think the film kind of reaches a proper conclusion to that, and there may never ever be one. But I don't fault them for it. It would have been nice to explore that a bit more. But it's just nice to see, hear about the Streetball crew that I had barely heard of growing up. But like the moment they said NOTIC and showed image or parts of the mixtape, I was like, oh yeah, I do remember this. Because I do remember 3-on-3 Hoop It Up in Vancouver downtown. And I do remember people talking about this team that just completely dominated. So it was just kind of interesting and nice to see. It is a very local story.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I can see why you connected with it on all those levels. So that's that's pretty cool.
Highly recommended. It was the best thing I watched at VIFF this year.
Okay. So then maybe we'll flip around to something that doesn't seem to be ranking very highly. So that would be the Book of Delights.
Okay, so I had heard this was based on a book, a very popular book, about a woman pretty much going through a midlife crisis. She's, I believe, a school teacher or some kind, and she had just moved into a new job. And she's looking for excitement, and a lot of it comes through like romance and sex.
What country is this from?
Okay, so this film is a mixed production, Brazil and Argentina. I believe it's set in Brazil though.
Oh, okay.
And it's supposed to be this like really erotic, coming of age film of a woman who's like rediscovering herself basically. We've seen films like this before. Like I feel like it's a very cliched story, and that's a lot of what happens here. The problem with this is I didn't find it particularly erotic. I didn't find it particularly compelling. It was not racy as I had heard. So, for example, blue is the warmest color. I kept hearing, people saying like, this is just a whole different level of romantic drama. With the way romance is portrayed. Book of Delights, not so much. It sounds weird, but I think the most interesting scene was probably the end credits. Because instead of like having the end credits roll where it's just like text on a blank background, it was actually text, but it was showing the main character basically coming to terms with this person that she had fallen in love with. I don't think there was very good chemistry between the two leads. I think there's a reason why this was released in 2020 and didn't get much buzz at all. And I just feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity and misadvertised. Skip it.
Yeah.
Don't.
Okay.
It's not that good. And honestly, like, there's a lot of like images. There's a lot of shots of like moonlight and the ocean, and it's supposed to be some sort of symbolism, but I could never connect the two dots together. It's kind of split up into different sections, and some of the excerpts from the book, maybe because I just don't know the literature, I couldn't connect with it. It didn't make any sense from a person who's never or heard or read the book that it's based on.
Okay. So maybe for like romance novel fans only.
It's not even like a 50 Shades of Grey, romance type novel. It's from what I know, the book is supposed to be deeply philosophical.
Oh, okay. I guess that didn't translate.
But I make it sound like it's some sort of like unfaithful type, erotic romantic drama, but it really doesn't feel that way.
Okay, yeah, well, it could be one of those situations where it's like, it's honestly like the VIFF programmers and the TIFF programmers do this too, where they're just sort of plugging things into the calendar because it happens to be available and it hasn't had a full release yet, so they're trying to get it out in front of people and hope that it finds a buyer or something.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, but like not every film at a film festival is good. Right?
No, exactly. Yeah, it's sometimes it's more it's not there so much to impress people, but it's there to find distribution. And if some distributing company thinks like, oh yeah, we can plug this into our gallery and not trick people into watching it, but just sort of like create an illusion that we have lots of content options. Netflix is very good at that.
Yeah, this is another one of those films where the protagonist, it was difficult to connect with her.
Right. Okay, well, tell me about one of your favorite actors of all time, Benedict Cucumber Patch. Is that what you've been calling him lately?
Pumpkin Patch, Cucumber Patch,
whatever
it is.
And he picked this movie that he decided to appear in. It feels like it's playing right into your hands because it's called The Electrical Life of Louis Wain.
Yes. So this is another biopic about Louis Wain. He's a famous artist. It's Louis or Louis. I think both. The guy who introduced the film said Louis, but in the movie they call him Louis.
Oh, all right.
So, and he's British, so I don't know why they use the French version. I don't know. There are a lot of questions about this film that I have that never get answered.
How you've managed to conjure images of such delight at such a dark time, I don't know.
Just remember, however hard things get, however much you feel like you're struggling, the world is full of beauty, and it's up to you to capture it, Louis, and to share it with as many people as you can.
So directed by Will Sharp. It's actually got an A-list cast: Toby Jones, Cucumber Patch, Claire Foy, Amy Lee Wood is in it a bit. Taika Waititi makes a small cameo. Olivia Colman actually makes a small cameo as well.
Okay.
But it's about Louis Wain. Louis Wain was an artist. You've seen his work probably before, and he draws very colorful cats with really big eyes.
Okay. So a little bit like that Tim Burton film from a few years ago with
Amy Adams, yes.
Yeah, okay.
With big eyes, yeah. So similar in that. Louis Wain, from what I've read and know, is a very interesting character. He's one of those eccentric artists that could never really capitalize on his talents because he just never cared for or never bothered to learn about the business side of things. So he gets duped all the time. He comes from a family of 6. He is the oldest and is forced to take care of his family. And even though it's sort of hinted that his family did quite well, like his parents, they end up running into financial trouble all the time, and they depend on him. The problem is that he can't make money, and he also is kind of schizophrenic, which is why he draws blue and green cats with huge eyes.
Okay.
From what I understand, he's never been officially diagnosed, but that's what a lot of people believe he has, and that's why he was able to paint these weird things.
Right.
But anyway, have you seen the trailer for this?
I have, because I understand that Amazon Prime has picked this up for their service. So it'll be coming out next month, I think, on that.
Right. So the trailer will have you believe that this is a quirky, kaleidoscopic, sort of acid trip type film that's, a cucumber patch vehicle for sure, but also mixed in with a lot of, bizarre things, sort of like mixing reality and fiction, not unlike, say, like the Pooh movies where Ewan McGregor and Winnie the Pooh kind of interact with each other. Unfortunately, I think this film really falls short on basically every level. Claire Foy, she's in it for half the film. I don't think she makes a particularly strong impression with the character. Toby Jones, again, I think a waste of his talent as well. They kind of float in and out when they need Louis Wain to progress into the next part of the movie.
Okay.
So if Louis Wain, needs a job, he goes sees Toby Jones. Toby Jones gives him an assignment or gives him, tells him something that's challenging, and Louis Wain kind of goes about and does it. Claire Foy comes in when we need to humanize Louis Wain a little bit, and she's the love interest and the eventual wife of Louis Wain. What I have a problem is it goes in too many different directions. The schizophrenia is only hinted at. We never really truly delve into it. There's a lot of side subplots about, his family, maybe suffering from mental illness and running into financial trouble all the time. It just seems like a bit of a scattershot film. None of it really ties all that well together. And I keep waiting for, a really bizarre scene where we enter Cucumber Patch's mind, where we see, all sorts of silly cats walking all over the place or jumping all over the place.
Right.
But we never quite get that there's really nothing electrical about this film other than, you know, a few passing references to like lightning storms and maybe, you know, the eccentric genius that is Louis WAIN. But I found it very dull. I think as far as biopics go, it doesn't really move you a lot either way. I mean, if you're interested in it, I would maybe softly suggest that you watch it, but otherwise I think this is a pass. This is one of the weaker films that I saw relative to expectations.
Right. Yeah, I'm not putting a huge rush on seeing it just yet. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff coming out for the rest of the year, so I feel like this might be something I circle back to early next year, maybe. Yeah, like, you know, in January when there's nothing coming out or something like that. So okay, well then I will talk about the last thing that I saw at VIFF this year, and that is Bergman Island.
I haven't seen this yet, but I will soon.
This is a movie very steeped, as the title would suggest, in the lore and the life and the movies of Ingmar Bergman, a famous Swedish art house film director who died in 2007, I believe. Responsible for movies like The Seventh Seal and Persona, Scenes from a Marriage, all sorts of, I think he made 50 films over the course of his career. He was also a theater director, and during a big chunk of his life, he lived on this remote island in Sweden that has since become a bit of a artist commune. And this film centers on two filmmakers, one played by Tim Roth, the other by Vicky Krieps, previously who became well known to North American audiences in Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread. And these two filmmakers go to Bergman's Island. They stay in one of the homes in his original compound. They're hoping to draw some inspiration from the place and from the man, and kind of, you know, reinvigorate the projects they're working on by being in this place. And so the main kind of conflict that arises earlier in the movie is just that Tim Roth's character, things seem to come much easier to him. He's able to fly through his writing. He's working on a new film. He's got calls coming in on his phone, constantly interrupting some of his conversations with his partner. And he doesn't seem to be particularly attuned to the fact that Vicky Krieps' character is suffering a little bit more. She's got a little bit more writer's block. She's also not as big a fan of Bergman as Tim Roth's character. So she ends up going on a little bit more of a looser exploration of the island, not really doing the whole Bergman touristy thing. And it's through those kind of more loose explorations that she finally starts working on a film, and they actually dramatize that film. You get a movie within a movie for a huge chunk of Bergman Island. And so we get this thing that Vicky Krieps' character is working on, involving a young director also on the Bergman Island, who's having her own relationship difficulties. This young woman is played by Mia Wasikowska in this film within a film. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I feel like I'm not really connecting with the characters in a way that I hoped when I started the film. I mean, maybe it's the kind of thing where you really need to be a huge fan of Bergman yourself to get more out of it. I would say you don't necessarily need to know his films, but I feel like you get more value if you do.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So this Bergman Island, is it like a literal or figurative island? It's
a literal island. I think when you land in Stockholm, like if you want to go visit this place, you have to go to Stockholm, then you have to get on a big ferry to go to a smaller island, and then you have to hop from island to island, basically. So it's pretty remote, and there's not a lot of structures there other than the places where he lived, and then some local villagers and stuff.
So this got a lot of buzz because the amount of insane acting talent is in this.
Yeah.
What did you think of the performance, and like where could it lead to something?
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really feel like the kind of thing that the Academy would go for, because
okay. I thought they would go for something like this.
Like, other than the fact that the two main characters are filmmakers themselves, that people might see some sort of similarities there, or they might identify with those people a little bit easier. But it's not a kind of like love letter to the industry or a satire of the industry in the way of like La La Land or even Official Competition, which we talked about before. So I feel like it doesn't really get too caught up in what the industry is. And so I feel like it's not really saying anything yet pro or con on that front. And I mean, Tim Roth and Vicky Krieps are very good in their roles. They're very believable. You definitely see this kind of edge of like, they're a little bit holier than thou. At least Tim Roth is, certainly. Like he's basking in his success quite a bit. So that reads pretty well. Like you can see what they're doing there. But I don't know.
I got a lot of Clouds of Sils Maria vibes from this.
Yeah, I can see where you get that, but I feel like Clouds of Sils Maria is more dramatic and more kind of weighted with like heavy kind of emotions. This is more muted, I think.
I see. Okay. All right. So pass, watch.
I would say if you like Bergman or you're familiar with Bergman stuff, definitely check it out. Or if you like the actors, but it's hard to recommend to a general audience.
I feel like you could say that about a lot of film festival films.
Well, yeah.
They're films that don't really have like a big audience or aren't aimed at a big, broad audience at least.
Yeah. That's why, sometimes you have to go to a film festival to track these things down because they can be hard to find otherwise.
Yeah.
So then closing out with the last couple that you watched, tell me about 1 Second.
Oh, 1 second. Okay, so this was surprisingly good. The most surprisingly good film I saw at VIFF. So this is directed by Zhang Yimou, who's a really famous Chinese director. He did a lot of great films. He did Hero, Raise the Red Lantern. He also, unfortunately, over the past few years, has kind of gone downhill, in my opinion. He started doing really commercial films. So he directed the Matt Damon film that we shall never ever talk about. And that's kind of like where he's gone. Like he was like an auteur. Him and Gong Li made some really, like famous, culturally significant films. And it just kind of went downhill like around the 2000s, I think. So 1 second.
出大事了，电影放不了了啊！今天电影放不了，责任不在我们。当然了，我们也可以死马当成活马医，抢救一下。让下，让一下，稳着点儿。把片子放下。
这是我剪的。
你给我放下。两面冲。
Released in 2020, but pulled out of theatrical distribution by the Chinese government for basically censorship violations. So the ones we see at VIFF and the one you'll probably see internationally is the one that has been edited. I would say that even though it has been edited, you probably wouldn't have known that if had you just watched the movie, you didn't know that beforehand, because the characters and the plots don't make a lot of sense. I think the censorship happened because it portrays China during the Cultural Revolution. So they're just coming out of Mao's Great Leap Forward, which caused the Great Chinese Famine. A bunch of people went hungry. A bunch of people died. It was a complete mess in the country. Now, 1 second is about a fugitive, this guy who has, I think, run away from a labor camp and gone to this small town because he wants to watch a film. Filming back then had to be approved by the government, and before the films were shown, there's always a newsreel, espousing communist ideals like, work hard for country, blah, blah, blah. Propaganda, basically. But he's looking for this film because he heard that within the newsreels, there is a footage of his daughter whom he had left behind long ago. Just so happens, though, that there's a young orphan named Orphan Liu, played by an actress in her theatrical debut, Liu Haochun. And she's really great. And she ends up stealing one of the reels. And the reel she steals is the newsreel that apparently contains footage of his daughter. So he chases her to the next town, where they meet the film projectionist. Unfortunately, during their travels, the film reel gets destroyed. The projectionist is distraught, and he's kind of the unofficial mayor because everyone loves watching these films. And he basically says, "Listen, if you guys want to watch this, you have to work together. We have to clean this up. We have to find all the footage before we can show it, because we're on a deadline. If we don't show it tonight, the next day it's going to a new town, and we won't be able to see this for another 2 weeks or however long it may be."
Right.
So this fugitive guy, he's desperate, right? Like, he really misses his daughter. He wants to see the footage, and it's just like sort of like a comedy of errors in a sense. It's very funny. Some slapstick, some good dialogue as well. Very good insight into what life was like in these remote desert towns where it takes place. Highly, highly, highly recommend it. Before I saw NOTIC, this was the best film that I had saw. I'm not sure if it's like in the grand scheme of film festival films that I've seen, if it's up there, but it definitely was one of my top 2 favorites, I would say, not including Handle with Care, which is a documentary.
Right. I wonder if especially with so many streaming services trying to do better at acquiring foreign films, like if any of the major players will pick this up for distribution. I mean, they are getting an edited version, so hopefully they wouldn't get scared of potentially annoying the Chinese government.
Well, this edited version is the one that's approved by the Chinese government. I just don't think we'll never ever see the unedited version ever. I don't think.
Right. Yeah.
And it's locked away or burned.
Yeah. Sneak into an editing suite somewhere in China.
Probably doesn't even exist then. It's probably like a state secret where it is or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't want to ruin it too much, but 1 second does refer to the reel that he is trying to get back. But I'm just going to say that. If it's available and you can find it, I highly recommend it, Rob.
Cool. All right.
Have you ever seen Cinema Paradiso?
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
Okay, so it's kind of like Zhang Yimou's love letter to film. There's no real antagonist. There's no real like bad guy. It's just film, basically a sort of historical part of film and how it's accepted in societies. Did you know that old film reels, they used to make those and turn them into like lampshades and stuff? I didn't know that until I learned this. Yeah, but it was kind of like stained glass for them, basically.
Right, because it was like raw materials and it had multiple purposes.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of an important plot point, but yeah.
Very cool.
Good.
All right, so just 2 to go then. Let's talk about HAVEL. HAVEL.
So I was drawn to this film because Václav Havel was a Czech politician who I had written about in my university thesis.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's how I knew. I wrote a lot about the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia as was then, but more importantly about the right to self-determination. So in a sense, nationalism and how countries become countries and how they establish borders and how they recognize, kinfolk, I guess. Is that the right word? Kinfolk? Biographical film. I found this again dull. So right away, like biopics just didn't do well at this film festival.
It can be a bit of a tortured genre, to be honest.
Oh, 100%. Like it has to have sometimes an external element that's brought in to make it interesting. Like there has to be something else beyond just birth, middle life, adulthood.
Yeah,
death.
Or like a time constraint. I mean,
right.
I always go back to like the Dewey Cox test. Like even though it even applies in like non-musician biopics. I feel like if there's a scene where it's like the film is introduced with a person kind of like thinking back. They're old and they're thinking back on where they came from. And it's like I just think of the line from Dewey Cox where it's like Dewey Cox has got to think about his entire life before he plays.
Yeah. So I will say there's really one really interesting creative decision made by the filmmaker, Slavak Horak. So Václav Havel, before he became a politician, was actually a playwright. And he got persecuted a lot because he was very critical of the Soviet Union and communism. So naturally, he's been thrown in prison a couple times. But every time he's thrown in prison, he writes a play about his struggles. And what the film does very interestingly is it kind of tricks you. So there are scenes where Václav Havel is being thrown into prison or being tortured or something like that. And then all of a sudden, the walls will break and you'll realize that, oh, it's part of a play or a set on a stage. And it kind of blurs that boundary. And it's a kind of a neat way of saying, this is what happened and this is how he sort of dealt with his struggles against the government. Where it really falls apart is, unless you know about Czech history, this film makes no sense. I mean, it does a really poor job of outlining why the Czechs don't like the Soviets. It does a really poor job of introducing key historical figures. It does a really poor job, I think, of fleshing out a lot of Havel's life and his motivations behind it. Very much so, he's in the background until someone forces him and sort of beats like a confession out of him. Only then do we realize why he's so into, basically rebelling against the Soviets.
Right. So it's kind of like made by Czechs for Czechs and Czech experts.
Yeah. So this was, I believe, a Czech. It is a Czech production, but I believe it's made by one of the public broadcasters in the Czech Republic.
Oh, okay.
So it's not as, maybe not as racy as you would like. It's not as violent or hard-hitting or gritty, whatever you want to call it. And certainly very targeted towards an audience that should already know something about Czechoslovakia. You can skip this unless you're really interested in some of the scenes where the reality and the scenes in a stage play are kind of mixed together. But other than that, I mean, it's just slightly better than Benediction, but only because of the creative choice the director made to blur the two lines.
Right. Well,
two worlds, I should say.
Maybe it'll become Czech Republic's submission for the Oscars this year, and who knows? Maybe it'll make its way to the top 5. But
no way. There's zero chance. Zero chance. I've seen Czech films. There are way better ones than this. If this is their submission, it wouldn't even make a short list.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. All right. So that just leaves us with one more, and that is The Worst Person in the World. And this is one that I'm actually interested in. I wasn't entirely sure because, I mean, there was a lot of critics raving about it, but I couldn't quite make out what it was about at first.
So I didn't know that critics raved about this one. So I kind of went into this kind of blind. I had heard of Joachim Trier, never seen his films before. I do kind of like films set in Scandinavia.
Was Joachim Trier part of the Dogma movement? Was that his thing?
I'm not sure.
Like with Lars von Trier and all those guys? It says here he's a distant relative of Lars von Trier, but
is he? Okay,
all
right.
I don't think he's related. I don't think he's part of that whole Dogma thing that Lars von Trier was part of.
Well, just even based on this film, it doesn't feel like it. But as I was saying, Scandinavian films really interest me. I saw Another Round last year; that was brilliant. But it tends to be about people who really don't hold anything back. They're very vocal about what they like and don't like, but they're not. They don't shout at each other too often. They don't throw things at each other too often, like we see in a lot of American films, where like every conflict seems to be like World War I or World War II.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing I hate but watching romantic dramas where the guy and the woman are just shouting at each other.
Right.
And it just gets a little too much sometimes because I don't think that's how normal people react most of the time.
Yeah. Most of us don't have anger management problems.
Yeah. But anyway, Worst Person in the World talks about Julie.
Let's go party.
Okay.
Okay.
Ha det.
Ha det. Vi var ikke utro, da.
Vi var ikke det.
Vi var ikke det.
Nei.
I'm gonna butcher her name. She's played by Renate Reinsve. I should probably really look this up. But anyway, she is really, really good. She plays the main character. Julie is this brilliant student who becomes basically bored with life. She's on track to become a surgeon, doesn't like it, becomes a psychologist instead. Doesn't like that, becomes a photographer. So, I mean...
Millennials, am I right?
Exactly. And along the lines, as she's growing up, it's a love story about her and two of her boyfriends. One is Axel, who is this really crass comic book artist, a bit of a misogynist, and definitely one of those artists who thinks his worldview is the be-all and end-all. She meets another boyfriend later, Ivan, who is actually a barista, so as far away from being a comic book artist as you can really be.
Right.
And he's much more subdued. He's not, maybe not on the same intellectual level, but he's a more kind-hearted person. And the worst person in the world the film refers to, I think, in my opinion, in my interpretation of the film, I think it refers to everyone. And now at various points in our lives, everyone can be the worst version of themselves.
Right.
So for Julie, she's the worst person in the world because she breaks the heart of two guys who love her a lot, just out of the blue. She's just like, I've had enough. I don't want to do it. And much kind of like her attitudes towards her profession. It's really funny at one point when she tells her mom that she doesn't want to be a surgeon, and her mom's like, well, okay, all right, well, just do whatever you want, and at least being a psychologist is still a professional. Then she says, I want to be a photographer, and her mom's like, her eyes are just wide open, just be like, why are you throwing this away? But
right.
She wants to be a supportive mom, and she says, okay, fine, as long as it makes you happy. I love the dialogue. There's certain creative decisions by director to showcase certain aspects of Julie's life. So there's one part where, how the cliche being like, once you meet the person you love, the whole world stands still. And it's kind of like that. There's a sort of like scene where all the background actors stop moving and it's just her and Ivan, and they sort of engage in this affair, and it's really interesting. But a lot of it depends on the lead, and Julie is a very charismatic lead. She's a very interesting character, in my opinion. Flawed, but very realistic, and I highly, highly recommend this film. It may not be for everyone, I think because certain aspects of Scandinavian culture is quite different from ours.
Okay.
And there's one scene where she takes magic mushrooms and she trips, where she has a hell of a trip.
Okay.
And
do they visualize the trip?
They do visualize the trip, and it's part prosthetics, part animation. I didn't feel like it fit in the whole film, but it was just kind of a nice break and a nice way of knowing that Joachim Trier has a lot of range, in my opinion.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I can definitely see myself getting into this one. I mean, it definitely seems to be picking up some interesting notices. The overall theme and plot line is definitely interesting to me. I mean, it's I'm kind of in that same age group, so I'm sure I can relate in some way to these people, even if they are terrible to each other at certain points. All right, cool. Well, I think that about does it for all of the films, like all the little capsule reviews that we were going to do.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just run through your ranking from worst to best.
Worst to best. Okay. Wife of a Spy is definitely last. By the way, it's directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who is, I don't think, not related to Akira Kurosawa either.
Okay. So
just like, don't get sucked in and be like, oh, this is a Kurosawa film. It's not.
Okay.
Starting at number 10, in reverse order, I'm not going to count the documentary because I've already said that's the best, and I feel like it's a different category anyway.
Oh, okay.
So at the bottom of the list, Wife of a Spy is number 10. Number 9 is The Book of Delight. Just didn't really understand it. Next level up. Next one is Girlfriends. And then The Electrical Life of Louis Wayne. I just think there's too many missed opportunities with this one. Then it's Benediction, Havel, Red Rocket, Official competition is third for me, even though it won the VIFF Audience Award. Worst person in the world is second, and 1 second is first. Although I am debating whether worst person in the world and 1 second should swap places. I think part of the reason why I had 1 second ranked so high was because it was so surprisingly good.
Right. It kind of like it overcame your expectations a bit.
Exactly. Whereas worst person in the world is as good as I thought it would be.
Right. Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, I mean, it feels like that'll probably be the end of our festival experiences for this season. So, I mean, I think on the whole we had relatively even-keeled kind of festivals. You know, there was some bad stuff, some good stuff, a lot of stuff in the middle. That tends to be how it goes.
Nothing that I thought was completely awful.
Right. Okay. So I did have one that I thought was pretty awful, which we talked about, France. But I mean, I feel like that it was made worse by its feeling like it was 4 hours, despite only being 2.25. So
did you ever want to walk out though?
Yeah, I mean, I've never walked out of a film because I hated it. I've never done that. That's like a rule of mine. Like, I feel like you should be able to tough it out. But it was
it came close.
Yeah, it was tough. Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely a couple films I've seen at VIFF that have really, really tested my patience.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think the next time you'll hear us will be for Dune. So
dun, dun, dun.
Get excited for that. We have a special guest lined up for that, as well as some new kind of fixins for the episode that you will hear when that debuts. So look forward to that. But until then, my name is Robert Snow in Toronto,
and my name is Jason Chen in Vancouver.
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.